The air inside the airport terminal thrummed with a restless energy. As Danielle Robinson stepped through the sliding glass doors, her leather suitcase rolling smoothly behind her with a faint hum against the polished tiles, the sharp aroma of brewed coffee drifted through the space, tangled with the distant bite of jet fuel seeping in from the tarmac beyond. She paused briefly, her dark eyes sweeping over the Senate travelers darting in every direction, their voices a chaotic symphony of excitement and urgency. Beneath her poised exterior, a quiet thrill pulsed in her chest. Today wasn't just another flight. It was the final stretch of a journey she'd been crafting for months, years even. Every late night spent poring over contracts, every sacrifice made in the shadows, had led her to this moment. The deal awaiting her at her destination wasn't just a transaction, it was a cornerstone, a legacy etched in ambition and resilience. Her cream-colored coat hugged her frame with tailored precision, the silk scarf around her neck fluttering slightly as she moved a splash of soft color against the sterile backdrop of the terminal. Danielle carried herself with an effortless grace, her heels tapping a steady rhythm against the floor as she wove through the crowd. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. Confidence radiated from her every step, a quiet assurance that didn't demand attention, but commanded it nonetheless. She'd spent years honing that presence, learning to thrive in spaces where people like her, black, female, unapologetic, were often met with skepticism instead of respect. The priority check-in line beckoned ahead, its silver sign gleaming overhead like a promise of efficiency and privilege. This was her domain, a perk she'd earned, a small reward for the battles fought and won. The line was short, a rare gift in the midst of the terminal's chaos. A few passengers lingered ahead of her, their heads bent over phones or murmuring polite nothings to the staff. Danielle adjusted the sleek leather passport holder in her hand, her fingers brushing against the worn edges. It wasn't just a case seat, was a relic of her journey, stuffed with the documents of a life built from scratch, triumphs tucked between the pages, reminders of every door she'd forced open. As she neared the counter, her gaze settled on the man behind it, Carter. His name tag declared in crisp black letters pinned to his starched uniform. He couldn't have been more than 30, with angular features and a posture that screamed self-assurance too much for a job that amounted to scanning tickets and offering rehearsed smiles. His movements were brisk, almost mechanical, as he waved the passenger ahead of her along. But when his eyes flicked toward Danielle, something shifted, a glint of impatience, a shadow of judgment she'd seen too many times before. She stepped forward, her suitcase rolling to a stop beside her. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm but steady, a thread of kindness woven into it despite the weariness she felt from years of proving herself. She slid her passport and ticket across the counter, her polite smile unwavering. Carter's fingers hesitated over the documents, his sharp eyes narrowing as he scanned her name, her face, her presence. For a fleeting moment, he was all business, then his brow creased, and his tone dipped into something patronizing. "This line's for priority check-in," he said slowly, each word dripping with an unspoken assumption. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" The question wasn't just a question, it was a challenge, a barb wrapped in Fox's concern. His lips twitched into a faint smirk, his gaze lingering as if daring her to falter. Danielle's smile held firm, though a spark of irritation flared deep within her. She straightened, her posture a silent rebuttal. "Yes, I'm sure," she replied, her voice calm but edged with steel. "That's why I'm here." Carter's smirk widened, as if her response was the opening he'd been waiting for. He flicked his eyes back to her ticket, then muttered under his breath, "This doesn't seem right. Let me check something." His fingers danced across the keyboard with exaggerated urgency, the clatter of keys cutting through the hum of the terminal. Around them, life pulsed on. Overhead speakers crackled with boarding calls. A child's laughter rang out nearby, and the steady beep of luggage scanners formed a distant rhythm. But at this counter, time seemed to stretch, warped by Carter's determination to make a point. Danielle stood still, her breathing even, her patience a shield she'd forged long ago. She could have snapped, could have demanded he hurry up, but she didn't. She let him dig his own grave, watching as his smirk returned with a vengeance. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with insincere regret as he looked up from the screen. "This ticket doesn't look valid. "Are you sure you booked this through the airline?" The accusation hung between them, sharp and deliberate. Danielle's pulse quickened, but her expression remained a mask of composure. "Yes, I booked it directly," she said, her tone firm now, unshaken. "Perhaps you should double-check." Carter faltered for a split second, caught off guard by her resolve. Then his eyes narrowed, and he leaned back slightly, reassessing her. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, the word ma'am laced with mockery. "But I'll need to call someone to verify this. Do you have any proof this ticket's yours?" Danielle's grip tightened on her suitcase handle, her knuckles brushing against the leather. She leaned forward just enough to hold his gaze, her voice low but commanding. "The ticket is mine," she said, each syllable deliberate, "and I'd suggest you be very careful about how you proceed." For a moment, Carter blinked, thrown by the quiet authority in her words. But then his expression hardened, and he waved over a security guard with a flick of his wrist. The guard lumbered over, a broad-shouldered man with a weary slump to his shoulders and a radio crackling faintly at his hip. His name tag read Jenkins, and his tired eyes darted between Danielle and Carter. Sensing the tension, but unsure of his role in it, Carter leaned toward him, his voice rising just enough to draw attention from the growing cluster of onlookers. "She's claiming this is her ticket, but it doesn't check out," he said, embellishing the story with a flourish that painted Danielle as some sort of imposter. Whispers rippled through the nearby passengers, some curious, some judgmental, their stares prickling against her skin like static. Danielle didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. Instead, she slipped a hand into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone, her movements smooth and deliberate. Her thumb scrolled to a number she knew by heart, and she pressed it to her ear. "Hello," she said softly, her voice steady but threaded with a quiet fire. "It's me. We need to handle something." She ended the call with a tap, her eyes locking onto Carter's with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. She didn't need to say more. The wheels were already turning. As she tucked her phone back into her pocket, Jenkins shuffled his weight from one foot to the other, his hand hovering near his radio as if debating whether to escalate this further. His weathered face creased with uncertainty. Had seen plenty of airport spats, but something about Danielle's calm unnerved him. Carter, meanwhile, seemed to revel in the spotlight. He leaned against the counter, his smirk stretching into a grin as he addressed the onlookers. "Folks, we've got a little situation here," he said loudly, his tone dripping with bravado. "Just making sure everything's legit." Danielle adjusted her scarf, her fingers lingering on the silk as she let the moment breathe. She could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes, the unspoken assumptions thickening the air. But she'd faced worse than this: boardrooms where her every word was dissected, deals where her worth was questioned before she'd even spoken. This was nothing. And yet, it was everything, a stark reminder of how power could be wielded carelessly, how justice could be twisted by those too small to understand its reach. Minutes later, the shift came. A woman in a crisp suit approached the counter, her heels clicking with purpose. Her name tag read Marla, and her expression was a mix of professionalism and thinly veiled panic. She whispered something to Carter, whose smirk vanished as if wiped clean. His face paled, his hands fumbling over the keyboard as Marla turned to Danielle with a tight, apologetic smile. "Ms. Robinson," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm so sorry for the confusion. Everything's in order. Please, let me assist you personally." Carter's eyes widened, darting between Marla and Danielle as the pieces clicked into place. Danielle didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply nodded, her composure unbroken, and handed over her documents once more. But the story didn't end there. Hours later, after her flight had landed and the deal was sealed, word spread like wildfire through the airline's ranks. Danielle hadn't just been a passenger, she had been the buyer. The ink was still wet on the acquisition papers when she made her first call. As the airline's new owner, Carter and his team, gone by morning. In that moment, justice wasn't just served, it was redefined. Danielle's victory wasn't about revenge. It was a lesson carved in the wreckage of arrogance. Power, when abused, has consequences, and she'd ensured those consequences echoed far beyond the terminal's walls. For Carter, for the onlookers, for anyone who doubted her, it was a reminder, Underestimating someone doesn't just cost you, it can unravel everything you thought you controlled. The air in the terminal was thick with tension, a palpable hum buzzing through the crowd as Carter's voice sliced through it, dripping with a rehearsed veneer of professionalism that didn't quite mask his disdain. "You see," he declared, loud enough for every onlooker to catch his words, "this is exactly why we have protocols in place. Priority check-in isn't some free-for-all, it's a privilege, not a right. We can't just let anyone saunter up here without proper verification." His tone carried the smug weight of someone who believed he held the upper hand. His chest puffed slightly as he leaned over the counter, eyes narrowing at the woman before him. Danielle stood motionless, her fingers tightening ever so slightly around the worn leather handle of her suitcase. The pressure was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it betrayed the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, letting Carter's words hang in the air like a bitter aftertaste. She didn't flinch, didn't snap back. Years of navigating spaces where she was underestimated had honed her patience into a weapon. She knew how to wait, how to let others dig their own graves with their arrogance. Inside, though, her mind churned. The sting of his accusation wasn't new, but it still pricked at her, a familiar thorn she'd learned to carry with grace. Nearby, a woman in a crisp navy pantsuit shifted her weight, her leather briefcase clutched tightly in one hand. She darted a glance at Danielle, her hazel eyes flickering with a mix of pity and discomfort. Her lips parted briefly, as if a word hovered on the tip of her tongue, perhaps an apology, perhaps a defense, but the impulse died as quickly as it came. She pressed them shut, her gaze dropping to the glowing screen of her phone, fingers scrolling aimlessly to avoid the scene unfolding before her. The unease radiating from her was palpable, her shoulders stiff as she wrestled with whether to intervene or retreat into the safety of silence. Around them, the crowd stirred restlessly. A few passengers shuffled their feet, their murmurs rising just enough to ripple through the air. Danielle caught snippets of their hushed judgments. "Unbelievable," one muttered, while another whispered, "She doesn't even look like she belongs here." A third voice, sharp and suspicious, added, "Maybe she's faking it." The words were like echoes from a past she knew too well, boardrooms where her presence was questioned, galas where her wealth was doubted, airports where her status was challenged despite the steep price she'd paid for it. Each syllable landed like a pebble in a still pond, rippling through her thoughts. But she refused to let it show. Today was different. Today, she held the reins. Even if Carter and the gawking strangers hadn't realized it yet, the tense silence shattered with the faint clatter of hurried footsteps echoing across the terminal. Heads turned as a man in a dark gray suit cut through the throng, his strides quick and purposeful. His salt-and-pepper hair gleamed faintly under the harsh fluorescent lights, combed with meticulous care, and a badge pinned to his jacket pocket flashed as he moved airport operations manager. The text just legible as he closed the distance. Sweat glistened on his brow, a thin sheen that betrayed his nerves, and his gait stiffened as he approached, as though bracing himself for a confrontation he hadn't fully prepared for. Danielle's keen eyes tracked him, noting the subtle signs of his unease, the way his jaw tightened, the slight tremor in his hands. This was a man who knew he was walking into a mess. He reached the counter and turned immediately to Carter, his voice low but edged with authority. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his tone leaving no room for evasion. Carter straightened abruptly, his smug facade cracking under the weight of the manager's gaze. He gestured toward Danielle with a flourish, his voice swelling with exaggerated righteousness. "This passenger," he said, emphasizing the word as if it were an insult, "was attempting to use the priority check-in line with a ticket that looked suspicious. I was simply following procedure to ensure everything was legitimate. You understand, of course." His lips curled into a faint smirk, as if he expected the manager to pat him on the back for his diligence. The manager didn't reply right away. Instead, he pivoted to face Danielle, his expression softening into one of cautious politeness. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentler now, "may I see your ticket and ID, please?" There was a flicker of concern in his eyes, a hint that he sensed something was off but couldn't yet place it. Danielle met his gaze evenly, her composure unshaken as she slid her passport holder across the counter with a calm, deliberate motion. She didn't speak, there was no need to. Her silence carried its own weight, a quiet challenge to the chaos swirling around her. The manager, Greg Bradley, as his badge proclaimed, opened the holder and scanned the documents inside. His eyes moved quickly at first, then slowed as realization dawned. His brows lifted slightly, and a spark of recognition flashed across his face. Subtle but unmistakable. He straightened, his posture shifting from deference to something bordering on reverence. "Miss Robinson," he said, his tone now threaded with respect, "I deeply apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced." The words tumbled out with a sincerity that caught Carter off guard. The clerk's head whipped toward Bradley, confusion clouding his features. "Wait, what?" he blurted, his voice cracking with disbelief. "You know her?" Bradley ignored him, his focus locked on Danielle. "If you'll allow me," he continued, "I'd like to personally escort you to the lounge while we sort this out. This situation should never have happened." His words were firm, but there was a faint tremor beneath them, a crack in his composure as he realized the gravity of the mistake. Danielle tilted her head slightly, her expression serene yet unreadable, like a still lake hiding turbulent depths. "And what exactly do you mean by sort this out?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with an authority that made Bradley flinch. The question hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the manager's faltering confidence. "Well," Bradley stammered, his hands fidgeting at his sides, "we'll, conduct an internal review of the check-in process," and Danielle raised a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. Her gaze shifted to Carter, who now stood rigid behind the counter, his earlier bravado evaporating. The smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped frown as his eyes darted between her and Bradley, searching for an escape that wasn't there. "Mister," she prompted, arching an eyebrow at the manager. "Bradley," he supplied quickly. "Greg Bradley, Mum." "Well, Mr. Bradley," Danielle continued, her tone cool and measured, "I'd like you to clarify something for me. Is this the standard of service your priority check-in staff is trained to provide a public humiliation? Baseless accusations, outright disrespect." Each word landed like a stone, heavy with intent, and Bradley swallowed hard, his face reddening under the scrutiny. "No, ma'am," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Absolutely not. This is unacceptable, and I assure you it will be addressed immediately." Danielle let his promise linger in the air, her silence stretching the moment until it felt almost unbearable. Then she nodded, just once. "Good," she said simply, "because I'd hate to think that this kind of behavior is tolerated at an airline. I've invested so much in." The statement hit like a thunderclap. Carter blinked, his mouth falling open as if to protest, but no sound emerged. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale and wide-eyed as the implications sank in. Bradley, meanwhile, looked as though the floor had dropped out beneath him, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. "I'll give you both a moment to reflect on what that means," Danielle added, her voice steady but firm, carrying the quiet power of someone who knew exactly how much control she wielded. She turned her attention to her suitcase, adjusting its position with a small, deliberate tug, as if she hadn't just turned the room upside down. Around her, the crowd's murmurs swelled, a mix of curiosity and awe threading through the passengers who had witnessed the exchange. Some craned their necks for a better view, while others whispered furiously to their companions, their words lost in the growing buzz. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket, and she slipped it out with a graceful motion. Glancing at the screen, a faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips as she read the message, a confirmation that the gears she'd set in motion were already grinding forward, faster than she'd expected. The storm was brewing, and she was its architect. The smile faded as she tucked the phone away, her expression settling back into its composed mask. The terminal seemed to shift around her, the once chaotic energy dimming as passengers leaned in, drawn to the quiet drama unfolding in her orbit. Carter stood frozen behind the counter, his confidence reduced to ash. His fingers twitched nervously against the polished surface, tapping out a disjointed rhythm that mirrored his unraveling thoughts. He'd overplayed his hand, and now the consequences loomed like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Bradley, too, was unraveling, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead as he struggled to regain his footing. The weight of Danielle's presence pressed down on them both, a reminder that power, when misused, carried a price. Bradley cleared his throat, his voice strained as he tried to salvage some shred of authority. "Miss Robinson," he began, hesitating as her gaze flicked back to him, "if you'd prefer, we can move this conversation to a more private location, perhaps the VIP lounge." His offer was tentative, almost pleading. Danielle raised an eyebrow, her eyes steady and piercing. "You seem eager to get me out of sight, Mr. Bradley. Why is that?" The question caught him off balance, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. It's for your comfort," he stammered, "and to ensure this situation is handled with the utmost discretion." Danielle tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "My comfort wasn't a concern when your employee decided to humiliate me in front of a crowd," she said, her voice calm but edged with a precision that cut through Bradley's fragile excuses. "So why is it a priority now?" Bradley's face flushed deeper, and Carter shifted beside him, his nervous energy spilling over as his fingers drummed faster against the counter. Neither man had an answer, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Before Bradley could muster a response, the distant sound of approaching footsteps broke through the tension. The sharp clicks of polished shoes against the tiled floor grew louder, drawing every eye in the terminal. Two men emerged from the crowd, their tailored suits marking them as figures of authority. The taller one moved with a quiet, commanding presence, his lean frame exuding confidence. The shorter, stockier man beside him carried a no-nonsense air, his broad shoulders squared as if ready to shoulder any burden. Both wore badges clipped to their lapel, senior executives from the airline, their rival signaling that the stakes had just risen. Danielle turned slightly to acknowledge them, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp as blades. The taller executive stepped forward, extending a hand in greeting. "Miss Robinson," he began, his voice smooth and measured, "we've been informed of the situation, and we're here to ensure it's resolved immediately." His words were careful, but there was a deference in his tone, an acknowledgement of the power she held not just in this moment, but in the broader web of influence she'd woven. The lesson here was clear, etched into the faces of Carter and Bradley as they stood, diminished. In her shadow, justice wasn't always loud or immediate. It could be quiet, deliberate, and devastatingly precise. And when power was abused, when protocols became weapons to wield against the deserving, the consequences could unravel even the most confident of men. Danielle had turned their arrogance into a mirror, forcing them to confront the fragility of their authority. And as the executives flanked her, ready to make amends, the crowd watched in hushed awe, witnessing the slow, inevitable turning of the tide. As Thomas Reed extended his hand toward Danielle Robinson, his voice carried a blend of warmth and professionalism that seemed carefully rehearsed. "I'm Thomas Reed, Vice President of Customer Relations," he said, his handshake firm yet fleeting, as if he were testing the waters of her mood. "This is my colleague, David Lynn, our head of operations. We got your call and made it a priority to get here as fast as possible." His hazel eyes flickered with a trace of concern, though his posture remained steady. A man accustomed to navigating tense situations. Beside him, David Lynn offered a curt nod, his sharp features softened by an attempt at a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Danielle met Reed's grip with her own strong, unyielding, a silent declaration of her resolve before releasing it and stepping back, her face a mask of cool detachment. The two executives cast quick, uneasy glances toward Bradley Gregg, the supervisor who now stood a few paces away, his broad shoulders hunched as if he could shrink into the linoleum floor of the bustling terminal. His earlier confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, perhaps hiding in the break room, or vanishing into the crowd of travelers dragging suitcases and chattering into phones. Nearby, Carter, the check-in agent, stood frozen behind the counter, his youthful bravado snuffed out like a candle in a storm. His hands trembled faintly as he clutched the edge of the counter, his pale face a stark contrast to the bright blue uniform that now seemed to swallow him whole. Thomas Reed's gaze swept the scene before him, taking in the crowded terminal with its flickering fluorescent lights and the faint hum of rolling luggage wheels. The air buzzed with hushed whispers from onlookers, travelers pausing mid-stride, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. A frown creased Reed's brow, subtle but telling, as he absorbed the thick tension that hung over the space like a fog. Turning to Bradley, he lowered his voice to a firm, controlled timbre that carried an edge of authority. "Greg, a word, please." It wasn't a request. Bradley nodded stiffly, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard, and followed Reed a few steps aside. Their conversation was a murmur, too low for most to catch, but fragments drifted toward Danielle like debris on the wind. "Unacceptable. Damage control. This cannot happen again." Each word landed heavily, stirring a quiet fire in her chest, though her expression remained an unreadable slate. Meanwhile, David Lynn stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Danielle with a cautious stride. His tall frame loomed slightly, but his posture softened as he clasped his hands in front of him. A gesture of contrition. "Miss Robinson," he began, his voice smooth yet tinged with genuine regret. "Please allow me to offer my personal apologies for what happened here. This isn't the level of service we aim to deliver net by a long shot. I promise you, we're taking immediate steps to make this right." His dark eyes searched her face for a reaction, but Danielle's gaze was steady, giving nothing away. She tilted her head slightly, her lips parting as she echoed his words with a deliberate slowness. "Immediate steps, and what, exactly, might those be, Mr. Lynn?" Lynn faltered, his confidence wavering as he glanced briefly toward Reed. Still deep in discussion with Bradley, he cleared his throat, choosing his words with care. "Well, for starters, we'll conduct a full review of our check-in procedures," he said, his tone measured as if testing her response, "and we'll ensure disciplinary action is taken against anyone found to have stepped out of line." His eyes darted to Carter, who stood rigid behind the counter, his knuckles white from gripping its edge. The young agent's face had drained of color, his earlier arrogance replaced by a dawning realization of the trouble he'd ignited. Danielle's gaze followed Lynn's, settling on Carter for a moment before returning to the executive. "That's a start," she said, her voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of steel. "But I'll be expecting more than just reviews and empty assurances." Lynn nodded quickly, almost too eagerly, as if desperate to appease her. "Of course, Miss Robinson. I'll oversee the process myself to ensure it's handled properly." His words were cut short as Reed returned, his expression grim, his jaw set in a hard line. Bradley trailed behind him, his head bowed, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a chastened schoolboy. Reed faced Danielle directly, his tone steady, but carrying a weight of deference. "Miss Robinson, I want to formally apologize on behalf of the airline for how you've been treated today. This doesn't reflect who we are or the commitment we have to our passengers." His hands clasped briefly in front of him, a small gesture of sincerity, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Danielle inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words, but she didn't respond immediately. The silence that followed stretched taut, broken only by the distant clatter of a boarding announcement and the soft shuffle of feet around them. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, deliberate, each word a quiet hammer strike. "I appreciate your apology, Mr. Reed, but words alone won't mend what's broken here. This isn't just about me, it's about how your staff treats anyone they see as other." Reed's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching faintly as he absorbed her words. He nodded, slow and deliberate. "You're absolutely right, Miss Robinson. I take full responsibility for making sure we address this root and branch." His sincerity felt genuine, but Danielle wasn't swayed by promises alone. She studied him, her sharp eyes softening just a fraction, a glimmer of cautious approval breaking through her resolve. "Good," she said simply, her tone unwavering, "because I'll be holding you to that." Then her gaze shifted to Carter, who flinched as if struck, his shoulders hunching under the weight of her attention. As for him, she continued, her voice cool and unrelenting, "I trust you know what needs to be done." Reed's eyes followed hers, landing on Carter with a cold finality. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice dropping to an icy register. "You're relieved of your duties." The words hit Carter like a physical blow. His mouth opened, a protest forming, but no sound escaped. His wide eyes darted between Reed and Danielle, disbelief warring with panic as the reality sank in. His hands fell limply to his sides, the counter no longer a shield, but a witness to his downfall. Danielle didn't linger to savor his reaction. With a graceful turn, she faced Reed and Lynn once more, her composure as unshakable as ever. "I'll leave the details to you," she said, her tone clipped but firm. "But rest assured, I'll be following up." With that, she lifted her sleek suitcase, her movements fluid and purposeful. A dancer gliding through a chaotic stage. The crowd parted instinctively as she strode toward the VIP lounge, her presence radiating a quiet authority that demanded respect without a single raised word. Behind her, the terminal erupted into a low roar of murmur-stravelers whispering. Staff scrambling to restore order, but Danielle's focus was already elsewhere. This wasn't the end. It was the opening act of a reckoning she intended to see through. The VIP lounge welcomed her like a sanctuary, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy of the terminal. The air was thick with the soft clink of glasses and the murmur of hushed conversations. A world of plush armchairs and gleaming glass tables arranged to offer privacy without seclusion. A waiter approached, his bow slight but practiced, a menu extended in offering. Danielle waved him off with a polite, fleeting Smelesh wasn't here to unwind. Instead, she chose a seat by the towering windows, the tarmac sprawling beyond the glass like a battlefield awaiting its next skirmish. The distant roar of jet engines rumbled through the panes, a reminder of the journey ahead, both literal and figurative. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, calm, composed, a portrait of contraband beneath that polished exterior. A tempest churned. She pulled out her phone, tapping it rhythmically against her palm as she weighed her next move. The executive's apologies had been swift, their promises polished to a corporate sheen. But Danielle knew better than to trust surface-level fixes. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb pausing over a name, Nathan. The line rang twice before a deep, steady voice answered. "Miss Robinson, what can I do for you?" "Good morning, Nathan," she replied, her tone crisp but measured. "I need a full status report on our acquisition. Has the deal closed?" "Yes, ma'am," Nathan said, his voice brimming with quiet confidence. "As of yesterday. The contracts are signed. You now hold controlling interest in the airline." A faint smile tugged at Danielle's lips, satisfaction flickering briefly across her face like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Perfect," she said. "I'll need an updated personnel file, specifically the priority check-in team at this airport, and a summary of any complaints filed against them in the last 12 months. Nathan paused, his tone shifting to cautious concern. "Is everything all right, Miss Robinson? Did something happen?" "Let's just say," she replied, her voice sharpening like a blade. "I've seen firsthand why this acquisition was necessary." A beat of silence hung on the line before Nathan responded, his resolve firm. "Understood. I'll have the files to you within the hour." Danielle ended the call and set her phone down, her eyes drifting back to the runway. Planes lined up in the distance, their sleek forms glinting under the morning sun. Poised like soldiers awaiting orders, her mind raced with planned precision would be her weapon. The incident at the counter wasn't just a personal slight, it was a symptom of rot, a failure of justice that thrived when power went unchecked. She had the authority now, but authority without action was hollow. She'd wield it carefully, ensuring her moves struck deep without destabilizing the airline's core. Her thoughts were interrupted by the approach of Reed and Lynn, their footsteps muffled by the lounge's thick carpet. They'd clearly been summoned by her presence, their expressions a mix of determination and trepidation. Reed clutched a leather folder, its edges worn from use, while Lynn held a tablet, his fingers hovering over the screen as if ready to pull up data at a moment's notice. "Miss Robinson," Reed began, his voice deferential yet steady. "Thank you for allowing us to join you. We wanted to update you personally on the steps we're taking." Danielle gestured to the chairs across from her, her demeanor calm but unyielding. "Please sit." The men complied, settling in with the practiced ease of seasoned executives. Reed opened his folder, sliding out a neatly typed report. "First, I want to assure you that Carter has been terminated, effective immediately. We've also launched a review of our customer service protocols to pinpoint any weaknesses that could lead to incidents like this." Danielle nodded, her expression inscrutable. "And what about Mr. Bradley?" she asked, her voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. Reed hesitated, exchanging a fleeting glance with Lynn, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The question hung there, a test of their resolve, a reminder that justice wasn't just about punishing the obvious culprits, it was about rooting out the systems that enabled them. For Danielle, this was more than a personal victory. It was a lesson in consequences, a warning to those who abused their power that accountability was no longer optional, and she would see it through, step by meticulous step, until the change was real. The air in the VIP lounge hung heavy with the distant hum of jet engines and the faint clatter of travelers beyond the glass walls. Danielle Robinson sat alone, her posture impeccable, her tailored blazer catching the soft glow of the overhead lights. Her reflection stared back at her from the expansive window, a mirror to her outward composure, a mask of calm that belied the storm brewing within. She wasn't just another passenger today, nor was she merely a high-profile figure caught in an airline's blunder. No, she was a force, a reckoning, her mind weaving through the threads of a situation that demanded not just resolution, but justice. Her fingers rested lightly on the cool edge of her phone, the faint buzz of a notification snapping her from her reverie. Nathan's name flashed across the screen, updates prepared. "Call me when ready," she exhaled softly, setting the device down with deliberate care, her gaze lingering on the text. Nathan was a constant, reliable, sharp, a cog in her carefully curated machine of advisors. But reliability wasn't enough now. She needed precision, a scalpel to cut through the rot she'd uncovered. Her eyes drifted to the personnel file she'd requested earlier, now open on the table before her. She scrolled through it with the practiced ease of someone who'd dissected countless such documents. Names, titles, performance reviews rolled past in orderly rows, a sterile catalog of human behavior. Then one name snagged her attention, Carter Miller. His record wasn't a blazing red flag so much as a slow drip of warning signs: rudeness to passengers, snide remarks, complaints of unprofessional conduct, small infractions, each one brushed off, accumulating like dust in a neglected corner. No single incident had been deemed severe enough for real consequences, and that was the problem. It was a pattern she'd seen too often, a system too timid or too lazy to uproot its weeds, letting them fester until they choked the whole garden. She set the phone down, her lips pressing into a thin line as her mind churned. This wasn't just about Carter. It was about the hands that had let him slip through the cracks. Across the room, the faint shuffle of footsteps broke her focus. She turned her head just enough to catch sight of a waiter approaching, his demeanor polished and deferential, hands clasped neatly in front of him. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice soft but clear. "I noticed you haven't ordered anything. Can I bring you something to drink? Perhaps a coffee or tea?" Danielle paused, her gaze flicking over him, young, earnest, his crisp uniform a stark contrast to the chaos she was unraveling. "A green tea, please," she replied after a beat, her tone measured. "No sugar." The waiter dipped his head in a slight bow. Right away, as he retreated, she leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking faintly beneath her. Her thoughts drifted to the morning's Evans Carter's sneering face. As he'd dismissed her at the check-in counter, the ripple of murmurs from the onlookers, the way Greg Bradley, the operations manager, had stumbled over himself to smooth it over. It had all been so predictable, so tiresomely familiar. But today, she wasn't the one on the receiving end of their incompetence. Today, she held the reins, and she intended to pull hard. Moments later, the waiter returned, setting a steaming cup before her with a gentle clink. The sharp, earthy aroma of the tea rose to meet her, cutting through the sterile air of the lounge. "Thank you," she murmured, her fingers curling around the warmth of the porcelain. She took a slow sip, the bitterness grounding her, sharpening her resolve. With a steady hand, she dialed Nathan's number. "Miss Robinson," he answered almost instantly, his voice crisp and professional, a lifeline in the chaos. "I've gone through the files," she said, her tone even but laced with intent. "I need clarification on something. The performance reviews for Carter Miller were signed off on them?" There was a brief rustle on the other end as Nathan consulted his notes. "Most of them were approved by Greg Bradley," he replied. It looks like he downplayed several complaints, categorizing them as minor incidents that didn't warrant further action. Danielle's eyes narrowed. a flicker of confirmation sparking within her. "And Bradley's record?" she pressed. "Any patterns I should know about?" Nathan's voice remained steady. "He's been with the company for over a decade. No major incidents, but no standout accomplishments either. He's been effective at maintaining the status quo, which might explain why he's overlooked issues like this." Her fingers tapped lightly on the table, a rhythmic pulse as she pieced it together. Bradley wasn't a villain in the traditional sense, no dramatic scandals, no blatant corruption. He was worse, a man who'd built a career on inertia, coasting through years of unremarkable service by dodging hard choices. His reluctance to act had created a petri dish for employees like Carter to thrive, emboldened by the absence of consequences. "I want a full report on his handling of staff complaints over the past 5 years, she said, her voice cutting through the line like a blade. "Specifically, how often he's taken action versus how often he's deflected responsibility." "Understood," Nathan replied, the faint scratch of his pen audible in the background. "I'll have that ready for you shortly." She ended the call, setting the phone down with a soft click, her mind already racing ahead. Accountability wasn't just a buzzword to her, it was the cornerstone of justice. Power unchecked was a disease, and she'd seen its symptoms too many times, in boardrooms, in bureaucracies, in the quiet corners where mediocrity was mistaken for stability. The sound of footsteps returned, heavier this time, purposeful. She glanced up to see Thomas Reed and David Lynn approaching, their faces a mix of determination and lingering unease. Reed clutched a fresh folder, his knuckles white around the edges, while Lynn gripped his tablet like a shield. "Miss Robinson," Reed began, his voice steady but tinged with deference as they reached her table. "Thank you for meeting with us again. We've prepared some additional information for your review." She gestured for them to sit, her expression unreadable, a calm sea hiding the currents beneath. "Let's hear it," she said, her words an invitation and a challenge rolled into one. Earlier that day, the tension had been palpable when Reed first broke the news. "Bradley has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review," he'd said, choosing his words with the caution of a man stepping through a minefield. "While his actions weren't as egregious as some might assume, we believe it's necessary to evaluate his leadership during this incident." Danielle had watched him, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal her scrutiny, but she'd held her tongue. Silence was her weapon, a vacuum that often pulled more truth from people than they meant to give. Lynn had jumped in then, leaning forward with a tap on his tablet, eager to fill the void. "Additionally, we're implementing immediate training sessions for all frontline staff, focusing on bias awareness and customer interaction. This will be rolled out across all priority check-in teams nationwide for the first time." Danielle's expression had softened, though only slightly. "That's a start," she'd said, her voice low but firm. "But training alone isn't enough. Culture doesn't shift with seminars and handouts, it shifts with accountability." Reed had nodded quickly, almost too quickly, as if desperate to prove he was on her side. "You're absolutely right, Miss Robinson. We'll be working closely with HR to ensure our evaluation processes reflect that." Now, as they sat before her again, she could see the weight of her earlier words still pressing on them. Reed's pen had flown across his notebook as she'd spoken, his posture that of a student scrambling to keep up with a professor's lecture. "Good," she'd said then, leaning back in her chair, her gaze sharp but thoughtful. "Because this incident wasn't just about one employee's behavior. It was about a systemic failure, and systemic issues require systemic solutions." They'd nodded in unison, their attentiveness almost comical if the stakes weren't so high. Her phone had buzzed then, pulling her focus briefly to Nathan's message about the personnel file. She'd scrolled through it in front of them, her silence a spotlight on their unease, until she'd landed on Carter Miller's name and the dots had connected. Back in the present, Reed cleared his throat, sliding the folder toward her. "We've outlined a detailed plan," he said, his voice steadier now. "Not just for this incident, but for the underlying issues that allowed it to happen." Lynn chimed in, his fingers swiping across his tablet. "The training is just the first step. We're revising our complaint protocols, adding layers of oversight to ensure nothing slips through again." Danielle listened, her expression unchanging, though her mind was already dissecting their words. It wasn't enough to patch the cracks they needed to rebuild the foundation. "I'll be reviewing these files myself," she said, her tone final. "In the meantime, I expect that report by the end of the day." Reed nodded, his pen moving again. "Of course, Miss Robinson. You'll have it." She allowed herself a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good. Because as of now, this isn't just an airline, it's a reflection of me. And I don't tolerate failure." The weight of her words settled over them like a fog, and for a moment neither man spoke. Finally, Reed stood, extending his hand. "Thank you for your patience, Miss Robinson. We won't let you down." She shook it briefly, her grip firm. "I trust you won't." As they left, she turned back to the window, her reflection once again staring back at her. She wasn't here to fix a single mistake, she was here to rewrite the story. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed by good intentions. It was a harvest reaped through action, precision, and an unrelenting will to confront power's abuses. The storm she'd set in motion was only beginning, and she intended to see it through to the end. Reed slid the folder across the polished table, its crisp edges parting to unveil a thick sheaf of meticulously typed pages, each line brimming with the weight of investigation. The faint rustle of paper filled the air as he settled back in his chair, his fingers brushing the edge of his notebook with a nervous energy he couldn't quite suppress. "Following our discussion earlier," he began, his voice steady but tinged with the urgency of discovery, "we've completed an initial assessment of the priority check-in team here at the airport. What we've uncovered so far points to some troubling weakness gaps in training that leave staff floundering, and a lack of oversight that's let sloppy habits fester unchecked." His eyes darted to Lynn, who sat beside him, already swiping at his tablet with a practiced flick of his wrist. A vivid chart flared to life on the screen, jagged lines and stark numbers painting a picture of discontent. On top of that, Lynn added, his tone clipped yet measured, "We've pulled together data on passenger complaints tied specifically to this location. The numbers don't lead. There's a clear trend of uneven service quality, especially among the newer hires who seem to stumble more than they succeed." Danielle sat across from them, her posture relaxed yet commanding, her dark eyes flickering between the two men as their words wove a tapestry of dysfunction. She said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch as she absorbed every detail, her mind already sifting through the implications. When they finished, she eased back in her chair, the leather creaking softly under her weight, her expression a blend of contemplation and quiet resolve. "This data," she said at last, her voice low and deliberate, "lines up with what I've long suspected. But slapping a bandage on these symptoms won't cut it. We need to dig into the rot beneath, unearth the root causes and yank them out, no matter how deep they're buried." Reed nodded eagerly, his pen hovering over his notebook like a hawk poised to strike, while Lynn offered a curt dip of his head, his agreement unspoken but palpable. "What's your next move, Miss Robinson?" Reed asked, his tone brimming with anticipation. Danielle lifted her teacup, the delicate porcelain cool against her fingers, and took a slow sip, letting the bitter warmth linger on her tongue as she gathered her thoughts. "First," she said, setting the cup down with a faint clink, "I want a comprehensive audit not just of this team, but of every priority check-in crew across our entire network. Don't stop at performance stats. I want raw, unfiltered feedback from passengers, their frustrations, their stories. Pair that with anonymous surveys from the staff so they can speak without fear of reprisal, and dig into how complaints are being handled or mishandled at every level." Reed's pen danced across the page, ink spilling in furious bursts, while Lynn's fingers tapped a rhythm of assent on his tablet. "Second," Danielle pressed on, her voice gaining an edge, "we need to overhaul the leadership setup here. Bradley's inertia has festered into a culture of apathy, and that's a failure we can't tolerate. I want a concrete plan, either retrain him to enforce accountability, or replace him with someone who will, no half measures." Reed flicked a glance at Lynn, a silent exchange passing between them. Before turning back to Danielle, "We'll get right on it," he said, his words clipped with determination. But Danielle's gaze sharpened, cutting through the air like a blade. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice firm and unyielding. "This isn't about papering over cracks or dodging blame. This is about transformational, lasting change that rewrites how we operate. I'm not here for quick fixes. I'm here to build something enduring. And I'll be watching every step to make sure it happens." Her words landed like stones in still water, rippling through the room and leaving a heavy silence in their wake. For a moment, neither man spoke, the gravity of her resolve pinning them in place. Then Reed nodded. His jaw set. "We understand, Miss Robinson. You've got our full commitment." A faint smile ghosted across Danielle's lips, her eyes glinting with a fierce determination. "Good," she said simply, "because anything less than success isn't an option." As Reed and Lynn gathered their things and slipped out to set her orders in motion, Danielle turned back to her tea. The once steaming liquid had cooled to a tepid bitterness, a quiet echo of the challenges looming ahead. She didn't mind the taste that sharpened her focus, steeled her for the battle she knew wouldn't be won easily. The lounge around her had hushed, the mid-morning bustle fading into a sleepy lull. Passengers trickled out toward their gates, their footsteps muffled by the plush carpet, while sunlight streamed through the towering windows, spilling golden pools across the floor. Danielle stayed by the glass, her hands resting lightly on the table, her tea abandoned as her thoughts churned. She reached for her phone, the screen's soft glow casting a faint light across her face, illuminating the intensity in her eyes. An email from Nathan awaited her, its subject line a stark promise, requested analysis, Bradley and team trends. She opened it, her gaze slicing through the dense paragraphs with the precision of a surgeon. The report was a brutal dissection. Every complaint, every fumble, every moment of inaction under Bradley's watch laid bare. A pattern emerged fast. Just as she'd predicted, Bradley shied away from conflict, opting for a shallow peace that let problems simmer unchecked. Complaints about Carter Miller, a particularly sloppy staffer, had been brushed off or buried time and again, each dismissal fueling his growing arrogance. Danielle shook her head, a flicker of irritation tightening her features. She tapped Nathan's number, the line buzzing twice before his calm, steady voice broke through. "Miss Robinson, Nathan," she replied, her tone hushed but heavy with thought. "This report is thorough, but it's a damn indictment. Bradley's negligence has bred a swamp of complacency. We can't let this spread. Give me a strategy to keep it contained." Nathan didn't falter. "Understood. I'll draft a plan. Stricter accountability protocols for all leadership roles. Should I include a framework for escalating unresolved complaints straight to corporate?" "Yes," Danielle shot back, "and tie those escalations to real consequences. If a manager buries a problem, they need to know exactly what they're risking. Consider it done." Nathan said, his voice a quiet anchor. She ended the call and set the phone down, her reflection staring back from the window, cool and composed on the surface, but beneath it, a tempest of resolve roared. A soft knock interrupted her reverie, pulling her gaze to the lounge's open doorway. A woman stood there, her navy suit crisp and tailored, her dark hair pulled into a neat knot at the base of her neck. She held herself with a quiet confidence, not stiff, but poised, her expression a careful blend of professionalism and curiosity. "Miss Robinson," she said, stepping forward just enough to signal intent, "I'm Amanda Lee, with the airline's legal department. I've been sent to assist with any issues during your visit." Danielle studied her, noting the calm way Amanda's hands rested at her sides, the slight tilt of her head that hinted at sharp attention. "Have a seat," Danielle said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. Amanda settled in, folding her hands in her lap with a grace that spoke of discipline. "I hear there was an incident this morning," she began, her voice even but warm. "I want you to know we're taking it seriously. If there's anything I can do, just say the word." Danielle's eyes narrowed slightly in distrust, but in assessment. Amanda's words were polished, yet there was a thread of genuineness that piqued her interest. "How long have you been with the airline, Miss Lee?" she asked, her tone probing. "Just over 5 years," Amanda replied smoothly. "I've focused mostly on compliance and corporate governance." "And what's your take on the company's culture right now?" Danielle's question was a scalpel, precise and unrelenting. Amanda paused, a fleeting hesitation, then met Danielle's gaze. "The airline's built on solid values," she said, choosing her words with care. "But there's work to be done. Consistency in living up to those values across every tier could use a stronger push." Danielle's lips curved into a faint, approving smile, diplomatic, she said, but not wrong. Amanda's shoulders eased slightly, though her focus held firm. If I may, Miss Robinson, what's your goal here? Moving forward from this mess. Danielle leaned back, her hands resting lightly on the table, her voice slow and deliberate. My goal is to turn this airline into a beacon not just of top-tier service, but of unshakable integrity. That means tackling the deep-seated causes, not just the fallout. Justice demands it, and so do I. Amanda nodded, her eyes alight with quiet understanding. I can help with that, she said simply. Danielle arched a brow, intrigued. How? I've worked closely with compliance on process overhauls, Amanda explained, her tone steady but alive with conviction. If you're aiming to root out gaps and hold leaders accountable, I can map out where the system's weak and how to shore it up. Danielle considered her for a long moment, weighing the quiet strength in Amanda's words, the understated competence that radiated from her. All right, she said at last, her voice firm. I'll be counting on you to deliver. The encounter lingered in Danielle's mind as Amanda left, a spark of potential amid the mire. She turned back to the window, the sun climbing higher, its light now a fierce gold that burned away the morning's softness. The lesson was clear: power unchecked bred chaos, and justice set through just iced-manded vigilance. Bradley's failures weren't just personal. They were a warning of what happened when authority shirked its duty. Danielle wouldn't let that stand. The reckoning had begun, and she'd see it through, no matter the cost. Amanda tilted her head ever so slightly, a subtle smile flickering across her lips like a candle catching a draft. This process is as thorough as it needs to be, she said with quiet confidence, her voice carrying a hint of reassurance. You won't be disappointed, Miss Robinson. As she rose from the table, her footsteps faded into the soft hum of the airport lounge, leaving Danielle alone with her thoughts. Danielle turned her gaze back to the wide expanse of the window, where her reflection now shared space with the shadowy outlines of planes gliding along the tarmac. The world outside buzzed with motion bag carts weaving through the chaos, ground crews signaling in the distance, but inside, a stillness settled over her. Change was on the horizon, not just for the airline she now led, but for every soul tethered to its sprawling machinery. And Danielle Robinson, as always, stood poised to steer it forward, her resolve as unshakable as the steel frames of the jets beyond the glass. She lingered there in the lounge long after Amanda's departure, letting the silence wrap around her like a familiar coat. The sunlight streaming through the windows had softened, its golden hue deepening as the afternoon stretched on. It bathed the room in a warm embrace, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Outside, the rhythmic dance of planes and service vehicles unfolded, a sprawling, intricate system she now commanded. It was vast, yes, and powerful, but Danielle knew a truth that gnawed at her. Even the mightiest engine could falter if a single cog slipped out of place. Her phone buzzed gently against the table, a soft vibration that tugged her from her reverie. She glanced at the screen, a message from Nathan, her trusted deputy, executive briefing scheduled for 3 p.m. recommendations attached. Let me know if adjustments are needed. With a flick of her thumb, she opened the document, her eyes scanning the meticulously crafted plan he'd laid out. Nathan's work was a masterpiece of precision. 3 phases unfurled before her. Immediate fixes to stop the bleeding, short-term restructuring to steady the ship, and long-term shifts to redefine the airline's soul. She nodded to herself, her lips pressing into a thin line of approval. He understood her vision, but there were always details to refine, edges to sharpen. Leaning back in her chair, Danielle let her mind drift to the hours ahead. The briefing loomed large, not just a response to the morning's fiasco, but a chance to etch her mark into the company's future. This wasn't about empty platitudes or band-aid apologies. It was about laying down a roadmap for something enduring, something real. Transformation, she mused, demanded both the precision of a surgeon's scalpel and the patience of a gardener tending fragile shoots. She rose then, pushing the conference room door open with a grace that belied the storm brewing within her. The hinges creaked faintly, and the low murmur of voices inside fell silent, as if the air itself held its breath. Every pair of eyes snapped to her as she stepped inside, her presence filling the space like a tide rolling in. She set her leather-bound notebook on the table with a soft thud, then took her seat at the head. Her movements slow and deliberate, a quiet declaration of authority. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady as granite, yet laced with an edge that brooked no dissent. "This morning's incident was unacceptable not just because of how I was treated, but because of what it exposed about the rot festering beneath the surface of this organization. We're not here to slap a bandage on this. We're here to rip it open and rebuild it." She paused, letting her words sink in, watching as they landed like stones in still water. Reed, the weary analyst to her left, shifted in his seat, his pen hovering over his notebook as if unsure where to begin. Bradley, the veteran manager across the table, stared at his hands, his fingers twitching nervously against the wood. Danielle turned to Nathan, seated at her right like a steadfast sentinel. "Nathan, walk us through the recommendations." Nathan stood with a nod, tapping his tablet to bring the screen at the front of the room to life. The words operational accountability and cultural transformation plan blazed across the first slide in bold, unapologetic letters. "The plan unfolds in 3 phases," he said, his voice crisp and commanding, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Phase 1 tackles the immediate messful audits of every priority check-in team across the country. We're digging into performance data, complaint logs, customer feedback. Anyone with a track record of screwing up or stepping out of line, they're on the chopping block retraining or termination, no exceptions." Danielle's eyes flicked to Bradley, who now stared at the table as if it might swallow him whole. Nathan's words hung heavy. No one was untouchable. "Phased shifts to the near future," Nathan pressed on, flipping to the next slide. "We're overhauling leadership training, rewriting how our people interact with customers, and setting up clear channels for complaints that don't get brushed under the rug. Plus, every manager, every single one, will go through mandatory bias awareness training." Danielle cut in, her voice smooth but firm, a velvet glove over an iron fist. "And that training isn't a one-and-done deal. It's a living commitment to excellence. This isn't about ticking boxes, it's about forging a culture where respect isn't negotiable." Nathan nodded, moving to the final slide. "Phase 3 is the long gamma cultural overhaul. We're forming an internal task force to keep this on track, plus anonymous reporting lines so our people can call out problems without fear of getting burned." The room fell quiet as Nathan sat, the weight of his plan settling over the executives like a storm cloud. Danielle let the silence stretch, her gaze sweeping the table. "This isn't just a strategy," she said at last, her tone calm but unyielding. "It's a promissetto every passenger who steps onto our planes, to every employee who clocks in each day, and to ourselves. We're building an airline that actually lives up to the values we've plastered on our ads." Reed nodded slowly, his sharp features softening with thought. "It's bold," he said, his voice measured, "but it's what we need." Danielle met his eyes. "It's not just necessary, it's non-negotiable." Her attention shifted to Bradley, who'd stayed mute through it all, his broad shoulders hunched like a man bracing for a blow. "Mr. Bradley," she said, her words slicing through the air, "you've been here over 10 years. Tell me, what have you done to fix these problems on your watch?" He shifted, his face flushing as he stammered, "Miss Robinson, I've always tried to keep things running smoothly. Complaints got handled as they came up," and she raised a hand, cutting him off. "Smooth doesn't mean sweeping dirt under the rug," she said, her tone sharp but controlled. "Your job isn't to dodge trouble, it's to face it head on. That's what leadership means." Bradley swallowed, nodding weakly, his bravado crumbling under her stare. "I expect your full support in this," she continued, "but let's be clear, your role's on the table. Everyone's is. Accountability starts with us." The room held its breath, her words a heavy mantle over them all. Danielle leaned back, her expression serene yet fierce. "This is day 1 of a new chapter for this airline," she said. "I expect every one of you to step up. Failure's not on the menu." With that, she snapped her notebook shut and stood, the meeting over. As she strode out, the sharp click of her heels echoed down the hall, each step a testament to the fire driving her. The groundwork was laid. Now the real fight began. Later that evening, Danielle settled into her first-class seat, the plane's engines humming a steady lullaby beneath her. The cabin glowed dimly, the soft light casting shadows across the leather upholstery. The briefing had unfolded as she'd anticipated, of agreement, pledges of loyalty, but she wasn't naive. Words were cheap. The proof would come in the weeks ahead as her mandates rippled through the airline's veins. This flight wasn't random. She'd picked it deliberately, a high-profile route dripping with luxury, and shadowed by whispers of arrogance among staff and passengers alike. If the airline's old sins were going to surface, this was the stage. A flight attendant approached, her uniform pristine, her smile a polished veneer. "Miss Robinson," she said, her voice a gentle murmur, "may I bring you a drink before takeoff?" Danielle studied her, noting the crisp lines of her attire, the careful tilt of her head. "Just water, thank you," she replied, offering a faint smile. The attendant glided away, her steps fluid, and Danielle's eyes lingered a moment before drifting to the window. Beyond the glass, the airport lights shimmered like stars against the night, a constellation of motion and purpose. The water arrived, cool against her lips, and as the plane climbed into the sky, she let her mind wander to the task ahead. The cabin buzzed quietly as first class filled with its usual cast sharp-suited executives, elegant leisure travelers, a smattering of familiar faces from magazine covers. The attendants wove through them, trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres in hand. Most exchanges were smooth, professional, but Danielle's trained eye caught the cracks. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored blazer snapped his fingers, his impatience dripping like oil. The attendant froze, her smile flickering, then hurried over as he barked something about his drink's chill. Danielle's jaw tightened, her face a mask of calm, but inside, she seethed. These weren't anomalies, they were threads in a tapestry of entitlement she was determined to unravel. Later, as dinner service unfolded, another scene snagged her attention. A young black woman a few rows back spoke quietly, but firmly to an attendant, her hands gesturing with measured restraint. Danielle couldn't catch the words, but the attendant's stiff posture and clipped replies spoke volumes. A second attendant joined, her presence easing the friction. Though the air still crackled with unease, Danielle filed it away, her mind already racing to the training overhaul Nathan was shaping. This wasn't just about bigots or bullies, it was about the quiet slights, the unchecked power plays that chipped away at dignity. That night, in the stillness of her hotel suite, Danielle stood by the window, the city's lights twinkling below like a promise. She thought back to the sparked humiliation at that check-in counter, the sting of disrespect that had lit this fire. It had grown into something bigger, a crusade not just for her, but for everyone the airline touched. She'd faced pushback, doubt, moments where the weight threatened to crush her, but each time, she'd risen with the same iron will that had carried her this far. This wasn't about one company or one fight, it was about what happened when you refused to bend, when you demanded better. The work stretched out before her, endless and exacting, but as she gazed at the horizon, a quiet smile curved her lips. The storm had birthed a revolution, a lesson in justice and the cost of power misused. She was ready to lead it, and the future was hers to mold.